Good evening, everyone. Very good to see you, and welcome to the beautiful Holywell Music Room. Welcome to Wadham, welcome to Oxford if you're visiting from outside, and particularly if you're watching online, welcome to our many alumni in different parts of the world. Always great to have you with us, and thank you for joining. It's a huge pleasure to welcome our panel. This evening is about celebrating the poetry of Seamus Heaney, but especially the edition of the complete Poems of Seamus Heaney, which was published to great acclaim at the end of last year, as I'm sure you've seen. And it's wonderful to be able to welcome two of the co-editors, Bernard O'Donoghue, who needs no introduction at all to anyone here, was of course a friend of Seamus Heaney's, among many other things, but for many years a Editorial Fellow here in English. And alongside him, Matthew Hollis from University College London, who is, again, with Rosie Lavan, one of the co-editors of this wonderful volume. And we're very grateful to you, Matthew, for coming down from London. And having the conversation with them will be Jane Griffiths, who, again, needs no introduction, Editorial Fellow here in Wadham and Professor of English, as Bernard was. So you're in very good hands, not least, of course, that these are three published and very distinguished poets themselves, no coincidence. So it's wonderful to be able to hand over to Jane, and I'll leave it to you to describe the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf. Digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out this evening to celebrate the publication of the Poems of Seamus Heaney, edited, as Robert said, by Bernard O'Donoghue and Matthew Hollis. It's a book that really is a monumental achievement, bringing together, for the first time, all the poems that Seamus Heaney published in his lifetime, the 12 individual volumes of poems, and also the uncollected poems that he chose to publish, but not in those volumes. Now, it really is true to say that Seamus needs no introduction, but I did just wonder what I would have said if he'd been here himself and had been about to read for us. And I thought, well, you would start by stating the obvious, saying he was born in 1939 in County Derry. You would say that his first book, Death of a Naturalist, was published in 1966. And then you would probably say that really quite soon after that, certainly by the late 1970s or very early 1980s, he began to be recognised really very strongly internationally for his work, and that we see this in the way that he was given academic acclaim in the visiting professorship at Harvard, the full professorship at Harvard. He was Professor of Poetry here, of course, in the very early 1990s. There were so many awards for the poetry itself. He won the Whitbread twice, he won the Forward Prize for Poetry, and of course, again, very early on, in 1995, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Poetry. But then, of course, far more important than that list of achievements and that list of awards is the poetry itself. It's poetry that is steeped in the history and culture of Ireland, but it's also poetry that's steeped in the deeply felt personal and incremental experience of being in and of the place, and it's poetry that seamlessly brings those two things together. And that, I think, is largely what we're going to be talking about this evening. So just to give you a sense of the shape of the next hour, what we'd like to do first is talk briefly about the editing of this volume and the kinds of decision-making processes that were involved in it. And then we'll move on to a loosely chronological look at Seamus's writing. There will be readings throughout. Unfortunately, Emily McLaughlin, who was going to read for us, can't be with us, so Bernard, Matthew and I will read in turn. And towards the end, there'll be time for questions, and then we'll end with a final recording by Seamus himself. So, perhaps I could start just by asking you about the origins of this project of editing the poems.
Well, there's a connection between us there because Matthew was the poetry editor of Faber when the years after, in Seamus Heaney's last years and after he died. So the question of an edition of the poems arose from about 2016, and Matthew, with the blessing of the Heaney family, asked me to start on the project. So that's sort of how it began, really.
And did it go to plan? Did you find that what happened in the course of editing was more or less what you thought would happen as you set out, or did it morph into something quite different?
No books go to plan. But what I would say about the genesis of the question, which is such a good one, is that when you lose an author, and particularly one as special with such international reach as you described, Jane, as Seamus, one of the responsibilities as a publisher and an editor is to consider how to encourage the readership of a writer when they're not there to do it for themselves. And I think one of the important things that I learned in my 20 years at Faber and Faber was the importance of considering the broader scope of the writer's work, which we'll talk about in a second, I'm sure, which opens up some very interesting ethical questions about unpublished material or uncollected material. But with Seamus at Faber's, we put together a series of works, one of which will be biographical to come, one of which was a volume of correspondence, and before that, a volume of his translations. But in a way, the guiding, the pole star was always the poems. So from a very early stage, the hope would be, with the family's great support, which was extraordinary, that we might, with the right team in place, put together an edition that in some small way could be worthy of the poet who begot it.
Yes. That puts quite a lot of pressure on you, doesn't it? In that sense, if you feel you are guarding the legacy and putting forward the legacy for the future, was that something you were conscious of throughout?
Well, I had no experience or expectations really from the beginning. I'm just a committed sort of enthusiast and reader, and just found my way into it, really. But the question of responsibility, of course, is a very major one. And as Matthew says, the Heaney family are notoriously benevolent and beneficent and generally generous in the view of the word. And it was wonderful working with them from the beginning, and it was clear that it would be. But there was the question, of course, of abiding by Seamus's wishes and choices. So there are the 12 volumes of poems, that the individual volumes, which are the central block of the poetry. But then there are a lot of poems published elsewhere by him with his blessing that weren't in those books. So there was tracking them down. And the question that arises, of course, is if he didn't put some of those poems into the individual books, what right have you got to put them back into the part of the kind of collected work? He said about North in 1975, it was the first book of mine that was to some extent designed. In other words, that was a book that of poems that had its own kind of subject and theme and so on. So there is that kind of consideration to bear in mind, you know, his pronouncements about what went into the book.
Yes. Did he say anything about what he wanted to have done with uncollected material, or were you simply having to almost play it by ear?
We never talked about that, actually. We talked about lots of things, and we had a lovely dinner in May of 2013, which was a couple of months before he died. And he hadn't been well before then. But the lunch was quite extraordinary, because we came out of that lunch with a list of something like 8 to 10 projects that we intended to take forward. And his tail was up, and he was really enthusiastic about them. And the first of them was, in his mind, going to be Aeneid Book 6, which we did indeed do with the family posthumously in 2016. But very much with Seamus having given that a cautious green light in our conversations. But we didn't extend towards collected poems. A lot of poets don't wish to have a collected poems in their lifetime. They often prefer to have a selection, and we spoke also about that. And Seamus was keen that there would be an edition of 75 or 80 poems in a slim selection, and that became the 100 poems that we did as well with the family. So he would look forward, I suppose, with one eye, but I think he was very keen to keep in his immediate vision what he thought he might actually do next. And part of that is obviously life's lucky charms, and none of us like to think too much about those future editions. So it was kept more in those terms, really.
Yes. So did that make it difficult? Could you talk a bit about the thought processes you went through in deciding that you were going to include some of the uncollected material, or the uncollected material?
Yeah. Well, we were committed from the first, weren't we, to include everything that Seamus had agreed to have published. So there wasn't really any problem with them. But of course, there's a great amount of material of all kinds, which was in a famous kind of car trip. He delivered his papers, you know, from South Dublin to the National Library of Ireland. A vast amount of stuff, you know. All the versions of all the poems, including those collected in volumes, but also lots of other stuff as well. And the fact, I suppose, that he put them into the keeping of the NLI meant that, you know, they were there to be looked at, as they were immediately by scholars and students and so on. So that was a kind of admission to include really anything that wanted to, really.
And I suppose it's just worth saying, isn't it, Bernard, that that might be me. The difference that we're talking about between collected and uncollected, and as Jane said from her introduction, Seamus curated 12 volumes of his own, but in between those volumes, as many poets do, especially early on, but not entirely early on, as we might talk about exclusively early on for Seamus. Poets often publish poems in individual journals, and often that's a stepping stone towards building up a full collection of poems. But interestingly, there were poems that Seamus published between collections that he chose not to include, didn't he? And it was over those conversations you can make a decision. I mean, there are many ways in which you can approach a collected volumes edition, and the simplest is simply to reproduce the books as the poet publish them in their lifetime. Other approaches to collected poems include exploding that idea and taking the poems out of the books that they were published in and running them in an entirely chronological order from composition, if you can do that, or through publication. But very early on, we took the view that we should respect the dozen books that Seamus put together, which, as we know and discovered in our research, was highly choreographed by him and highly intensive. But it left the interesting conversation about, should you include poems that Seamus approved enough to have published, but also didn't necessarily want to have in his collection, and why? But we thought we should. Yes. And we thought we should for reasons of quality, and also because these were things that Seamus chose to publish.
Yes, and of course it does smooth out a kind of chronology as well, because there are some of the uncollected poems fill in gaps really between, and it's a striking thing in itself to see the places between the different volumes where there are a lot of poems and where there are very few. I mean, for example, before North, there were only about 3 or 4 uncollected poems. So, and perhaps it was the fact that a volume like that was kind of coherent and thematic, meant that there were poems that just didn't fit there. But there's also the kind of dilemma, kind of poems which seem very suited to the volume that they didn't appear in. So there are decisions to make there as well, really.
Yes, it is interesting, isn't it, that it's not necessarily a question of a poet thinking these poems are not worthy of going into the volume, but there's a sense of the volume as something with an overall shape, and a particular poem possibly duplicating something that another does, or simply not fitting. So I suppose by allowing us to see the material in between, you are making available something of the thought processes that were there between the volumes, and maybe that went into the making of the volumes as well, which is fascinating.
And with some really interesting and surprising results as well. And we began listening to digging, which many people would understand instinctively as not only one of Seamus's great and famous poems, but one of his first, if not the first. I mean, it's the first poem in the first book, and it seems the right place to start. But of course, when we go into the work in this edition and research, we realise it's not the first poem, and it's not the first poem Seamus published. And in fact, this might be a moment, Jane, because the first poem that Seamus did publish was one that drew your eye.
It was, yes. It's a poem called Reaping in Heat, and it is the first poem in the new poems. And it drew my eye, I think, partly because it both does and doesn't sound like Seamus Heaney as we know him. It's a poem that was published in 1959, so 7 years before Death of a Naturalist, in a magazine called Q. And I think I'll simply read it so you can judge its sound for yourselves. Reaping in Heat. Hushed and lulled lay the field, under a high sky sun. Pushed and pulled came the rasp of steel on stone. For, slashing the drowsiness, the mower was whetting his scythe, and the sycamores heaved a sleepless sigh. Close hills shimmered liquidly, fascinating the mower. Larks' trills shimmered down the thin burnt air. Lower and deeper and cooler sinks now the sycamore's shade, and naked sheaves are whitening on the empty stubble.
So Seamus was an undergraduate at Queen's when he published that poem. And of course, Bernard, he didn't put his own name to it, did he? No. How did he sign that poem off?
He called it incertus, uncertain, undecided. And he published several poems under that title in his time as a student. And there's another kind of echo in that poem, because later on, when he starts, from quite an early stage in his career, he started to comment on his own procedures and to evaluate them, to say what he thought was good and bad, in a very kind of amusing and wry sort of way. And there's a poem that he wrote to his friend Seamus Dean, called The Ministry of Fear. This is written in the 1970s when he's starting to evaluate his poetry, where he stands generally, and trying to describe where his position was socially in Northern Ireland as well. At this point, the Ministry of Fear is talking about what it was like being, a kind of Catholic poet growing up in an unfriendly sort of evaluative environment. And he refers to that poem, and he says this. He says, "I tried to write about the sycamores and innovated a South Derry rhyme with hushed and lulled, full chimes for pushed and pulled." And as Jane read it, of course, you have to say hushed and lulled and pushed and pulled. But you wonder how he thought it was a rhyme. Was it which was the U sound there? But anyway, he does start to pass judgment on his own procedure early on.
He did, and even early on, though, Bernard, publication came towards him very quickly, didn't it? I'm just thinking about that moment when he writes to Seamus Dean, and that's the same moment that he's both advising Seamus Dean on his writing and publication life, as Seamus's is just blooming, isn't it? Because shortly around that time, Seamus gets a letter from Charles Monteith at Faber and Faber, doing what exactly? Can you remember?
Asking to see where he'd seen some poems of Seamus Heaney's in the New Statesman. So as editor of Faber, he wrote to Heaney and said, send me some poems. And as Heaney said, it was like getting a letter from God Almighty. And it sort of went on from there. But again, it's an indication of where he placed himself, really.
And at the time, he was making a difficult dilemma to be an Irish poet publishing in Ireland, or following the line through London. And of course, he does deliver his typescript for Death of a Naturalist into Faber's during his honeymoon in London. And so the two things sort of marry in that sense, don't they, at the same time? And the first collection comes together based a lot on some of the early work from which you heard Jane just read a little bit, but also an absolute blooming of poems from about 1962 through to about 1965 that seem to just open up for Seamus, don't they, enormously. And the book had the most extraordinary reception, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And of course, the reason that he wrote so many poems between sort of 63 and 65 was because Monteith said, we're not quite sure this is a whole book yet, but when you've got some more, send them on, So he just wrote a hell of a lot, as he put it, and that was the substance of the extremely successful first book, The Death of a Naturalist in 1966, which won all the prizes. But the moral was, if you should just crack on, you should keep trying, really, and keep writing.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that helped with the evolution of his own very strong voice. Because in Reaping in Heat, there's something about it, perhaps particularly the end, the naked sheaves whitening on the empty stubble. There's something about the empty stubble and the rhythm of the closing statement that sounds to me very Seamus Heaney. But before that, there's something, he talks himself, I think, about the influence that Hopkins had on him. And the mower was wetting his scythe, and the close hills that shimmered liquidly, fascinating the mower. There's something there in the very, very young Seamus Heaney that is pastoral poetry, that is something that's known academically, I think, that's feeding through into his own poetry. And that's something that seems to have just gone by the time we get to Digging, which was why I was so fascinated by the alternative openings. So I think maybe that instruction to just go and write perhaps contributed to shedding the kind of apprentice poetry where you're modelling your work on somebody else's and moving into his own full voice.
Yes. And of course, the big change from that point onwards, historically, was Northern Ireland between 1966 and 1969, when it really sort of exploded, really. And he said later, the book that is most controversial, really, and most representative of the condition in Northern Ireland was North, as the title suggests, in 1975. And he said later on that, despite the pastoral nature of things like Death of a Naturalist, up to North, that was one book, which is quite interesting because it didn't seem like one book to the readers, really, because North seemed to be a very different kind of book from the ones before it, especially from Death of a Naturalist.
But and that's so interesting, wasn't it? Because then we have the political world coming into his work at that time, at the same time that his craft has already developed, but is increasingly going on to develop. And a little bit later, in the years after North, or a similar time, he writes about this development of craft and technique, and he uses a distinction, doesn't he, Bernard, between the words craft and technique, which is quite unusual because we tend to use them often interchangeably in writing. And Seamus says that craft is the kind of thing that wins you poetry prizes, and you can learn that in a workshop, and there's a certain kind of rote to it, and you learn your prosody and so on. But he talks about dropping the windlass into the well of yourself. And when you drop down the bucket, most of the time when you wind it up, you come up with a taking of air, empty, and then you just drop it down again, and you keep going and you keep going. And then eventually, he says, there's a moment where you break the skin of yourself. You break the skin of yourself. And what you return with is what he calls technique. And in that moment, he thinks he found a way to get under the surface of your materials. And that partly comes from the agrarian background that he was living in, and the Moyola, and being on two sides of the stream, which was the most extraordinary political metaphor for what he was writing about. But it really takes its shape during that period you're describing with the events in Northern Ireland, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, he says that the other big influence on his writing and his thinking was reading the book by P.V. Globe called The Bog People, about these ritual burials in Denmark. And Heaney then interprets, or at least compares, the situation in Northern Ireland to what was found in poems like The Toland Man and so on.
Which, Bernard, I think you were kindly going to read, because The Toland Man coming from Wintering Out, which very much in a way a partner book to North as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the principles, anyway, that bears out is that you can't make absolute distinctions between the volumes, and that the end of Wintering Out, which is a very much admired book itself, which is Heaney's third book, goes with North, really, rather than with the predecessors. But the Toland Man begins one of these buried figures in Denmark by saying, "Someday I will go to Aarhus to see his peat brown head." The Globe book has extraordinary graphic black and white illustrations of these dead bodies, and reflecting on them, Heaney says, "I could risk blasphemy, consecrate the cauldron bog our holy ground, and pray him to make germinate the scattered, ambushed flesh of labourers, stockinged corpses laid out in the farmyards, telltale skin and teeth, flecking the sleepers of 4 young brothers trailed for miles along the lines. Something of his sad freedom as he rode to the tumbril should come to me driving, saying the names Toland, Groballa, Nabelgard, watching the pointing hands of country people, not knowing their tongue, out there in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes. I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home."
And that lovely line, that lasting, lost, unhappy, and at home, he'd found his, as it were, great metaphor for that period, for exploring the history and strife and painful revenge of the troubles in Northern Ireland in the discovery of the bog in Denmark, in Aarhus, which was a landscape not unlike the landscape that he was moving in physically, and in fact moving at that point, because this is the same time that Seamus is moving out of Northern Ireland. He's been to Berkeley, hasn't he? He's gone to America for the first time. And in fact, that poem and many of them around for Wintering Out were actually written in California, even though they speak to Ireland particularly. And he said that he felt that distance was actually essential for the letting in of space and light into the work, didn't he? But he's going through a time of Bloody Sunday, and he's relocating to Dublin at this point, isn't he? And also shortly to Wicklow. So could you say something about that, Bernard? Because that was a big move for Seamus at that time in that political moment, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, and I think maybe the year in America, he said, was very significant. I think in suggesting a kind of moving. He always maintained, of course, a deep sort of fondness for the terrain of Northern Ireland, and I mean, just as a kind of biographical fact, when they'd settled in their house in Dublin eventually, at the end, they still wanted to have, you know, a kind of holiday house in Derry, and never gave up on this. So it wasn't a clean break from one world to another, I think. But perhaps it was a kind of opening out. And he said, of course, that after North, he thought the poem that Holland Man is in Wintering Out, but poems like that, those northern violent poems, he wanted to get away from that. And they were expressing these short, augur-like rhymes, you know, these short lines that drilled down into the physically into the earth, but mentally into a kind of a sort of conscience or awareness. But he said he wanted to get away from that, and his next book, 1979, was sort of significantly called Field Work, which has this nice back to a kind of pastoral air to it.
And it's a book that looks very different on the page as well, isn't it? Because, as you say, the Wintering Out in North, which are the third and the fourth books, typographically in their verse formation, are very, very tight and unified. There's that one short breath Heaney quatrain that marks both of those books as sibling volumes, really. And then when he gets to Fieldwork, he lengthens the line, and the breath comes with it, doesn't it? And there's this almost exhaling as Seamus appears to be finding new ground and new material to write about. And one of those materials was family, which was there in the early books, but particularly in relation to his parents then. But he also began to write poems about his children as well, didn't he? And then we have this sort of middle section, as you say, from Fieldwork onwards, where Seamus seems to be writing to the generation above as well as below. And then after Fieldwork, we have the extraordinary Station Island as well, which is an incredible kind of pilgrimage. And some of his most intense and moving family poems are to be found in that book as well, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. And it's a purgatorial book, which again is a kind of significant thing. You've been reading Dante, and Dante's Purgatorio in particular, and there is a kind of, it's another kind of regretful sort of book. I mean, it's primarily biographical, but it's wanting to open out into atonement, really, almost for what had gone before.
And you say atonement, and also, I think, Jane, you mentioned it earlier on, responsibility, and that's something that you see very strongly in this period of work, it seems to me. And there's an extraordinary poem that he writes for his two boys, in which he talks about inheriting, handing to them the long-tailed Hall of Grief. And so the complicated inheritance that he was feeling living in this very political world and a very protective family man, and the inheritances that his children were going to come through is a new ground in the writing, and a very touching and moving one. And that idea of a kite for his sons Michael and Christopher is an image that runs through a number of his poems, and as we'll find out when we talk about it, or hear it a little bit later, right to the very last as well, wasn't it? And that lovely metaphor he has between things sailing half free on the tug of a string, and also your need to be grounded, or the responsibility to be grounded on the earth, is never stronger than in this middle period of his life.
And of course, the period after Station Island was when he came to Oxford, and Oxford kind of saw him in action, really, as Professor of Poetry. His book called Seeing Things was seen as a kind of dramatic change of direction again, because it was a kind of a different sort of poem, this 12-line form that he invented, and were extremely introverted poems, and they were explorations of the self.
And Jane, I think you were one of those that caught your eye, had it not, from Seeing Things?
Yes.
Not maybe one of the 12-liners, but something else.
Yes, I thought it might be nice for us to look at a couple of the sonnets from Glanmore Revisited. We were talking just now about fieldwork and the opening out, and the importance of family coming in. And in that book, there's a series of Glanmore sonnets that are very grounded, of course, in that the families move to a particular cottage in Glanmore, and in Seeing Things, there are some poems that revisit that, and I thought it might well be nice to hear some of those. There's, to my mind, something lovely about the way that in the later book the poems revisit what was already writing that was steeped in two time frames, that was very aware of living in a place that had previously been lived in. And then when we come to Glanmore Revisited, there's a sense in which Seamus is looking back to the earlier poems as well as to the things they were looking back to. So it becomes a lovely sort of layering of time. And I thought it would be nice to read a couple of poems from this sequence. The first one, so the third from Glanmore Revisited, is Scene Shifts. Only days after a friend had cut his name into the ash, our kids stripped off the bark. The first time I was really angry at them. I was flailing around the house like a man berserk, and maybe overdoing it, although the business had moved me at the time. It brought back those blood brother scenes where two braves nick wrists and cross them for a sign. Where it shone like bone exposed is healed up now. The bark's thick-eared and welted with a scar, like the heroes in a recognition scene in which old nurse sees old wound, then clasps brow, astonished at what all this starts to mean, and tears surprise the veteran of the war. And then the second one from that sequence is the last. It's called The Skylight. You were the one for skylights. I opposed cutting into the seasoned tongue and groove of pitch pine. I liked it low and closed, its claustrophobic nest up in the roof effect. I liked the snuff-dry feeling, the perfect trunk-lid fit of the old ceiling. Under there, it was all hutch and hatch. The blue slates kept the heat like midnight thatch. But when the slates came off, extravagant sky entered and held surprise wide open. For days I felt like an inhabitant of that house where the man, sick of the palsy, was lowered through the roof, had his sins forgiven, was healed, took up his bed and walked away.
You might have said, Jane, of course, that when we were talking about editorial decisions earlier on, that you were the first publisher of one of those poems, and it was significant variants in your magazine Owl.
Yes, this was actually an extraordinary example of Seamus's generosity. When I was an undergraduate, I was co-editor of a magazine called Owl that I founded with a friend, a former undergraduate. And I wrote to Seamus and said, could he possibly spare us a poem or two? And he said yes, and sent us 4 sonnets, including I've just lost my place, including 4 from the what became Glanmore Revisited. And there is a very interesting variant in that the poem Scene Shift that I just read. In the sestet of the sonnet, we get, where it shone like bone exposed is healed up now, but even so there is another scene preparing in the ash tree's welted scar, in which old nurse sees old wound, then clasps brow, astonished at what all this starts to mean, and tears surprise the veteran of the war. So I think there's something interesting going on there in that, to my mind, in the revised version, there's a kind of through line. The scar is the thing that is the revelation, whereas in this version, it's as if the revelation comes about almost despite the scar. And it's interestingly, differently shaped and does something different to the movement of the poem. So I was delighted to be reminded of this, but also I think delighted to have a look at this version, see, as you say in your notes, how very different it is, and then be startled into that comparison and thinking how very different these two versions are. And again, as your volume invites us to do, thinking about the thought process that might have gone into that and what might have informed those decisions, why the through line rather than the contrast.
Yeah. And of course, both versions bring out the Homeric parallel in a very marked way. And of course, he's a very learned poet, despite his approachability, pretty well throughout his life, and especially in that middle period, he's extremely elusive to the classics, especially the Latin classics, of course.
I have to say, Jane, when you were doing that, any mention of variant poems just editorially makes you break out in sweats. It's like that. It's like, because we do record variants in our edition, so where we know of different versions, and we trace Seamus's changes of mind and changes of heart. But it just reminds me of that. If anyone can remember that BBC Blackadder episode where he meets Samuel Johnson, having just completed the English dictionary, the first dictionary, boasting he had every word in the language, and Blackadder says, "What every word?" And he says, "Yes, every word." And Blackadder offers him his contrafibulations for having got it right, and of course he starts rewriting his book instantly, which is what I'm put in mind of. But I think that thought of tracing the movement of the path is one thing that we were keen to try and do, weren't we, Bernard? And at this moment, of course, so much is changing in this path for Seamus, because he's very recently lost his mother and father at this period of the poems that we're talking about. And he's also experiencing a more international world than he had before. He's teaching at Harvard, round about this time as well, or he has been for a few years. And a lot around him has changed. The Irish ceasefire has led to the Good Friday Agreement. Seamus has written The Curate Troy, his first drama, which includes the lines that become some of his most famous of all. And what are those, Bernard?
Yeah, Hope and History rhyme, has become universally quoted.
Exactly, and words that find their way into the office of 2 different presidents of the United States. And the international profile's changing, and around this time, as you mentioned, James, Seamus wins the Nobel Prize for Literature as well. So the world that had begun, as it were, nationally in the early books for Seamus, and then had also become more interior in his writing about the family, was beginning to open up in this period as we begin to shift into what the last 10, 15 years of his writing. Isn't that right, Bernard?
Yes, yeah. And of course, a classic instance of that was the response to 9/11, wasn't it? I mean, anything can happen in the poem.
Which we should read in a second. Yeah, we'll do that. And of course, it opens up a moment where we talked about the Curate Troy, and Seamus has long been interested in translation, but is becoming really quite an active part of his writing life now, isn't it? And including the poem that we'll read in a second, but of course, around that time, Beowulf as well. But shall I start with the Horace? So we're now moving into the period of the mid-1990s. Seamus has been working on Horace, and he's working on a poem at the terrible time of the Twin Towers attacks. And very soon after that attack, this poem is published in the newspapers, and something quite extraordinary happens, and it moves around the world with a kind of electric speed because of the parallels that had been in the poem, or that Seamus had seen into the poem, or that we as readers were reading into the poem at that moment. And this is the poem in question. Anything can happen. Anything can happen. You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather head before he hurls the lightning. Well, just now he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. It shook the earth, and the clogged under earth the river Styx, the winding streams, the Atlantic shore itself. Anything can happen. The tallest towers be overturned, those in high places daunted, those overlooked regarded. Stropped beak fortune swoops, making the air gasp, tearing the crest off one, setting it down, bleeding on the next. Ground gives. The heavens' weight lifts up off Atlas like a kettle lid. Capstones shift, nothing resettles right. Telluric ash and fire spores boil away.
And with that, Matthew, do you think we could go to the last reading?
We can.
And I think maybe we'll finish off with another kite, a kite for Avine. This is the last poem in the book, in the most recent book. This is for, it's basically a translation that has been appropriated and made hibernicized to some extent. It's an Italian, a wonderful Italian poem called Aquiloni, The Kite, by Giovanni Pascoli, late 19th century, early 20th century writer. But this is for a grandchild. There was a lot of sorrow and elegy in the book, but our grandchild arrived, the second grandchild in this case. I have poems for the first grandchild earlier on, but there's a big long one, so we can't. It's kind of a sequence of 12 poems. You don't want that. So this is for number 2, and her name is Avine. So this is A Kite for Avine, and after Pascoli. Air from another life and time and place, pale blue heavenly air is supporting a white wing beating high against the breeze. And yes, it is a kite. As when one afternoon all of us there trooped out among the briar hedges and stripped thorn, I take my stand again, halt opposite Anahorish Hill to scan the blue, back in that field to launch our long-tailed comet. And now it hovers, tugs, dives, veers askew, lifts itself, goes with the wind, until it rises to loud cheers from us below. Rises, and my hand is like a spindle unspooling. The kite a thin-stemmed flower, climbing and carrying farther, higher,
the longing in the breast and planted feet and gazing face and heart of the kite flyer, until string breaks and separate, elate, the kite takes off, itself alone, a windfall. Thank you very much.